When historians rank the worst monarchs in Spanish history, one name sits at the absolute top of that list. Every single scholar who studied his reign comes to the same conclusion. There has never been a more depraved, more cruel, more sexually deviant king to sit on the Spanish throne. But you don't know the real story. Because what you've been told about royal marriages, noble bloodlines, and the dignity of European monarchy, it's all a carefully constructed myth designed to hide the grotesque reality. Ferdinand III didn't just rule Spain. He turned the royal palace into a den of sexual horror that would make even the most hardened brothel madam blush. Before he became known as Rey Felón, the Felon King, he was a prince so physically deformed, so sexually incompetent, that his own mother-in-law wrote letters describing him as not even a man. This is one of the only documented cases in European history where we have multiple eyewitness accounts from royal physicians, foreign diplomats, and the victims themselves, all describing the same horrifying anatomical reality that shaped a nation's destiny. What you're about to discover will completely shatter your understanding of royal power. It's simultaneously the most pathetic and the most terrifying story of sexual dysfunction ever recorded in the annals of monarchy. So, let me take you back to a wedding night in 1819 that became so infamous even the Pope had to intervene. October 1819, the Royal Palace of Madrid. A 16-year-old princess sits trembling in her wedding chamber. Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, raised in a convent, innocent to the point of believing babies came from stalks, waits for her new husband to arrive. She's been told nothing about what happens on a wedding night. Her German attendants, too embarrassed to explain, simply dressed her in white and left her alone with a rosary clutched in her hands. Then the door opens. What enters isn't the charming prince from fairy tales. It's a 35-year-old man, overweight, gouty, with thick, protruding lips and the eyes of a predator. But that's not what makes the young queen's blood run cold. You see, Ferdinand III suffered from a condition so extreme, so grotesque, that modern medical science still struggles to explain it. Macrogenitosomia. In plain English, his genitals were monstrously oversized, but not in the way you might think. French writer Prosper Mérimée, who interviewed courtiers present that night, described it in horrifying detail. Thin as a sealing wax taper at the base, and as thick as a fist at the end, as long as a billiard cue. Imagine being a sheltered 16-year-old girl, raised by nuns, suddenly confronted with that. The young queen took one look and bolted from the bed, screaming in pure terror. But here's where it gets worse. Ferdinand, drunk on wine and lust, gave chase. Picture this, a morbidly obese, 35-year-old king stumbling around the bedroom trying to catch his teenage bride who's literally running from at her life. The girl was fast, the king was not. Enraged by this insult, Ferdinand did what any reasonable monarch would do. He burst out of the bedroom completely naked, his deformity on full display, and began screaming at the queen's attendants. He called them "and brutes," demanding they prepare the queen for him within 15 minutes. These poor ladies, including the queen's own sister-in-law, had to somehow explain to a terrified child what was about to happen to her. Whatever they said made things infinitely worse. When Ferdinand returned, ready to claim his rights as a husband, he was met with a smell that no amount of royal perfume could mask. The young queen, in her absolute terror, had lost complete control of her bowels. The King of Spain in all his grotesque glory found his wedding bed soiled with human waste. He recoiled in disgust, declaring that queens do not possess the fragrance of civet, and stormed out, refusing to touch his bride for over a week. But this was just the beginning of Maria Josepha's nightmare. To understand how a wedding night could go so catastrophically wrong, we need to talk about what Ferdinand II was hiding under those royal robes. And I warn you, this gets medically graphic. Multiple physicians who examined the king left detailed records. Dr. Jose Maria de la Fuente wrote, "His Majesty possesses a member of such extraordinary dimensions that normal conjugal relations are rendered impossible without causing severe injury to his partner." But it wasn't just the size. The shape itself was an aberration of nature. Remember Merimie's description. Thin at the base, massive at the end, like some kind of medieval torture device. This wasn't a blessing. This was a curse that had haunted Ferdinand since his first marriage at age 17. You want to know how bad it was? Let me tell you about that first wedding night. In 1702, young Prince Ferdinand married his cousin, Maria Antonia of Naples. On their wedding night, the prince, quoting directly from Maria Antonia's letters, nearly gawked at his bride and awkwardly fondled her, repeatedly groping her bosom, unsure how to proceed. He literally didn't know how sex worked. For 11 months, this marriage went unconsummated. The prince would become aroused, attempt to mount his wife, then nothing. He physically couldn't figure out how to make it work. Maria Antonia's mother, Queen Maria Carolina of Naples, wrote increasingly frantic letters. "My daughter weeps nightly. The prince feels nothing. Attempts to induce him are useless. There is no pleasure or effect. This situation is extraordinary and unfortunate for whoever is at his side." Eventually, the royal confessor had to intervene. A Catholic priest had to sit down with the future King of Spain and explain in explicit detail how to have sex with his wife. The humiliation spread through every European court. The Spanish heir was a sexual incompetent, a physical freak who couldn't perform the most basic marital duty. When he finally managed it after nearly a year of failures, the damage was catastrophic. Maria Antonia suffered 2 miscarriages, likely from internal injuries, and died at just 21, her body broken by her husband's deformity. But here's the sick part. Once Ferdinand finally figured out sex, he became obsessed with it. The death of his first wife in 1806 freed Ferdinand from the marriage bed. But it also unleashed something monstrous. The prince who couldn't perform became a king who couldn't stop. When Ferdinand returned to power in 1814 after Napoleon's defeat, he was 30 years old, sexually frustrated, and drunk on absolute power. What followed was a decade of debauchery that would make Caligula blush. Every night, the king would slip out of the palace wearing a dark cloak. His destination, the seediest brothel in Madrid. His favorite was run by a madam nicknamed Pepa la Malaga. Ferdinand didn't go alone. He assembled a crew of young aristocrats, men as morally bankrupt as himself. Together, they turned Madrid's red light district into their personal playground. Here's where it gets truly perverted. Ferdinand was so proud of his deformity, the very thing that had humiliated him in youth, that he turned it into a party trick. Multiple witnesses report the same stomach-turning scene. The King of Spain, drunk on cheap wine, would challenge his companions to measurement contests. Each man would expose himself, and they'd literally compare sizes. Ferdinand always won. His friends even gave him a nickname, El Bibendo, the well-endowed one. The king would strut around these brothels, his monstrous anatomy on full display, bragging about his conquests. But the bragging was the least disturbing part. Ferdinand had developed a particular fetish, one that reveals the true depths of his depravity. In his own words, recorded by Count Jose Maria de Villalobos, the king boasted, "They leave my bed certain that no other man can give them the pleasure I gave them. And do you know what I enjoy most after possessing them? Collecting the rags stained with the proof of their maidenhood." Let that sink in. The King of Spain collected bloodied sheets from the virgins he deflowered. He kept them as trophies. This wasn't some medieval tradition. This was a personal fetish, a grotesque hobby that he pursued with the same enthusiasm other kings collected art. While the Prado Museum was being built, ironically by his neglected second wife, Ferdinand was building a collection of blood-stained evidence of his conquests. The prostitutes at Pepa Malaga's weren't his only victims. As he traveled around Spain, Ferdinand left a trail of ruined women. A widow in Aranjuez, a peasant girl in Sachedon, servants in the palace who couldn't refuse their king. Each encounter added to his collection. Each bloody rag another trophy in his chamber of horrors. Meanwhile, Spain was falling apart, while Ferdinand spent his nights measuring genitals and collecting virgin blood. His country lost its entire American empire. Liberal reformers were executed by the thousands. The economy collapsed, but the king didn't care. He had brothels to visit, women to ruin, trophies to collect. This was the man who would take 3 more wives. 3 more women who would discover that marrying the King of Spain meant entering a nightmare beyond imagination. In 1816, Ferdinand needed an heir. His solution? Marry his own niece. Maria Isabel of Braganza was 19, plain-looking and Portuguese. 3 strikes against her in the Spanish court. Madrid's gossips greeted her with a cruel rhyme, "Fi portuguesa chapesa, ugly, poor, and Portuguese. Suck on that." But Maria Isabel had something her husband lacked: dignity. While Ferdinand continued his nightly brothel raids, she quietly founded the Prado Museum and opened the Royal Academy to women artists. She tried to bring culture to a court drowning in depravity. Ferdinand barely noticed. To him, she was just a wound, a vessel for the heir he desperately needed. In 1818, she became pregnant. This is where Ferdinand's story transforms from grotesque comedy to pure horror. When Maria Isabel went into labor, complications arose immediately. The baby was breech. The queen was fading. The royal physicians faced a choice: save the mother or save the child. Ferdinand made the decision without hesitation: save the child. He commanded, "Cut her if you must." What happened next was witnessed by 12 people, all of whom left matching accounts. The surgeons began performing an emergency cesarean. Remember, this is 1818. No anesthesia beyond alcohol and opium. They sliced open the queen's abdomen, believing her unconscious. She wasn't. Midway through the procedure, Maria Isabel's eyes shot open, and she let out a scream that echoed through the palace. She was awake, fully conscious, as they cut through her womb. The surgeons, panicking, continued their butchery as the queen writhed in agony. The baby was already dead, had been for hours. Maria Isabel bled out on the operating table, her final moments spent in unimaginable pain, sacrificed for a child that was never going to live. She was 21 years old. The queen's sister publicly blamed Ferdinand for her death. Palace whispers suggested that his deformed anatomy had caused complications during conception. Others pointed to his syphilis, a gift from all those brothel visits, as the cause of the stillbirth. But Ferdinand felt no guilt. Within a year, he was shopping for wife number 3. After all, he still needed that heir. If Maria Isabel's death was a tragedy, what happened to Ferdinand's third wife was even more grotesque. But let's return to those trophies Ferdinand mentioned, his collection of blood-stained cloths. Because this is where Ferdinand's perversion reaches its darkest depths. After his death in 1833, Maria Cristina ordered a discreet inventory of the king's private chambers. What they found defied belief. Hidden in a cedar chest wrapped in silk were dozens of cloth squares, each carefully labeled with a date and a name. Carmen Paper's house, March 1821. Isabella, palace servant, January 1823. Maria, widow Venice, September 1824. Ferdinand hadn't been exaggerating. He really had been collecting these grim mementos for nearly 2 decades. Each piece of cloth represented a woman, some willing, some not. who had experienced Ferdinand's particular brand of brutality. But the collection revealed something else, something that palace observers had long suspected. The dates clustered around specific events. After every political setback, after every liberal uprising he crushed, after every execution he ordered, Ferdinand would add multiple trophies to his collection in quick succession. Violence in the throne room led to violence in the bedroom. The man who signed death warrants by day collected virgin blood by night. When Ferdinand died in 1833, Spain barely mourned. His own brother immediately declared war. His daughter would face multiple civil wars defending the throne he'd engineered her onto. His widow quickly remarried a common guard, scandalizing the nation one final time. But Ferdinand's true legacy wasn't political. It was personal. He had transformed the Spanish monarchy from a sacred institution into a sordid joke. Every king after him would be tainted by association, every royal marriage viewed with suspicion. His daughter Isabella II inherited more than just his throne. She inherited his sexual appetites. Her own scandalous affairs and rumored nymphomania led to her overthrow in 1868.